So I'm sure that you've all seen photos like this, photos of Trump's failed coup. And you may also take a note of the various symbols on display. The Christian flags, Jesus banners, Confederate flags, a wooden gallows, and of course, lots and lots of Trump flags. I think many progressive observers were puzzled by this juxtaposition of symbols. They saw apples and oranges, symbols of religion and nationalism, racism and vigilantism, libertarianism and authoritarianism. But what Samperi and I saw was a fruit cocktail, which we call white Christian nationalism. My talk today is based on our 2022 book, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to Democracy. And in it, we address the what, when, who, how, and where. In the course of the lecture, I'll offer three definitions of white Christian nationalism. I'll talk about who embraces and propagates it, both historically today, and I'll talk about when it first emerged, how it's changed over time, how it works rhetorically and politically, and finally, I'll talk about where it's headed and why it's become a mortal threat to American democracy. So what is white Christian nationalism? One way of thinking about it is as a political vision, or in social science jargon, a set of attitudes and preferences about politics and policy, which is mostly how Samperi thinks about it. He's a survey researcher, and he's constructed a scale that he uses to measure Christian nationalism and assess its effects. It's based on a series of questions that have been asked in several surveys over time. And here are the questions. There we go. Sorry, so having a little trouble managing the tech here. There we go. In a study released last year, Robert P. Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute constructed a similar scale using a somewhat more targeted set of questions. So just how many Christian nationalists are there? And who are they? In an earlier book with Andrew Whitehead, Perry divided survey respondents into four categories based on their scores on the Christian nationalism scale. They found that almost half of Americans partly or strongly affirm Christian nationalism. Jones's estimate is a little bit lower, around 30%. Some people ask whether white Christian nationalism is just another way of saying conservative white evangelical. Certainly, some people do use it that way, but that is not the case here. In fact, it overlaps with a number of different religious traditions. As you can see, not all conservative white evangelicals are white Christian nationalists, and many non-whites and non-evangelicals are. And here is a similar breakdown by Whitehead and Perry. So really, here's the key takeaway. Christian nationalism and white evangelicalism overlap a great deal, but they're not the same. And in fact, some of the most outspoken critics of white Christian nationalism are conservative white evangelicals. I'm thinking here of people like Tim Alberta, David French, Beth Moore, Russell Moore, and Peter Wenner, some of whom you may know by name. And what could even add the faculty of the conservative evangelical Wheaton College and from my hometown to this list. They released a statement condemning January 6th, Christian nationalism, and white supremacism in no uncertain terms. So just what do Christian nationalists believe? Well, obviously, they believe that America is a Christian nation, or that it was and should be again. That is really the defining characteristic, as Perry and I understand it. But what else? Well, interestingly, if they're white Christian nationalists, they also believe in a strong military. They support the police. They want law and order, but they also oppose gun control and mask wearing and government regulation. They are, of course, pro-life, but also pro-death penalty. It goes without saying that they're against, quote unquote, government handouts, even for kids, and 3 cheers for free market capitalism in the mix. So really no surprises here, right? That's basically the Republican Party platform, insofar as it still has one beyond loyalty to Trump. Though it is surprising if you step back for just a moment. After all, what does any of this have to do with Christianity, right? And that's not the only puzzle. Ask a white Christian nationalist if they're racist, and you will probably get an earful. Like most white Americans, they will loudly insist that they're not biased or prejudiced. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence tells a different story because Christian nationalism is strongly associated with various indicators of racial animus. Amongst other things, it's correlated with opposition to interracial marriage and interracial adoption, and with support for strong borders and immigration restrictions. It's also positively correlated with a strong sense of white identity, as well as with anti-Black animus. Strong claim, I know, but I'll show you just one receipt here. If you take a look at these two graphs, you'll see that they chart the relationship between degree of Christian nationalism and beliefs about discrimination amongst both Black and white Americans. And as you'll notice, Christian nationalism has no effect on these beliefs amongst Blacks. The lines are flat. But there is a highly linear relationship amongst whites. White Christian nationalists believe that Blacks face very little discrimination and that whites face a lot of discrimination, and the higher their score on the Christian nationalism scale, the more strongly they believe these things. And this is why Perry and I talk about white Christian nationalism rather than Christian nationalism. So let's turn from the what question to the when question. That is, when did white Christian nationalism first emerge? The short answer is 1690. You didn't mishear. I didn't say 1960. I said 1690. Before I explain why, let's take a second pass at the what question. White Christian nationalism is a political vision, but it is also a deep story in Arlie Hochschild's sense. A deep story is like a bare-bones movie script, a melodrama with heroes and villains and a fairly predictable plotline. The deep story of white Christian nationalism is simple enough. America was founded as a Christian nation. The founders were Orthodox Christians. The founding documents are based on biblical principles, maybe even divinely inspired. America is divinely favored, hence its power and prosperity. But America is now threatened by non-whites, non-Christians, and non-Americans on its soil and on its borders. It must be kept white and Christian, or made so by whatever means necessary. Otherwise, its power and prosperity are at risk. So you might be wondering where people get such ideas. Well, the answer is from many different sources. If you crack open the history and civics textbooks used by many Christian nationalists, you'll find it right there in black and white. You could just grab tickets to the Reawaken America extravaganza organized by Michael Flynn. Or if you prefer something just a tad more highbrow, then you could check out something by the Christian pseudo-historian David Barton. If he's not going to be in your area, then just navigate to wallbuilders.com and you can order some of his books or videos. There's lots and lots of merch on sale. If you're more interested in getting politically involved, you can also sign up for Ralph Reed's Freedom and Faith Coalition. They're all in on Trump as well and on Christian nationalism these days too. As these examples make clear, white Christian nationalism is not just an ideology, it's a movement, or rather an ideology that connects various movements across the religious and political spectrum, and that is being propagated by various cultural entrepreneurs. Some of those movements are primarily religious, others primarily political, but all mix conservative religion and reactionary politics. And the influence of the ideology extends well beyond the boundaries of these organizations, and for that matter, beyond the bounds of the conservative Christian subculture. Paradoxical as it may sound, white Christian nationalism is increasingly a secular movement. Christian nationalism overlaps with the religious right, but it's not identical with it. Nor did Christian nationalism originate with the Christian right. The deep story is an old story, a much older story, and it's not really just one story. It's three stories in one. Three stories taken from Scripture and then woven together into a single political ideology. Perry and I call these the promised land story, the end time story, and the racial curse story. In the promised land story, the New England Puritans imagined themselves as a new Israel, quite literally. At first, they cast out England in this role, but over time, they came to see the New World as their real promised land. They also came to see the native tribes as their enemies, analogous to the biblical Canaanites or Amalekites who were occupying their land, people who had to be driven out or destroyed. In the end time story, the Puritans' wars with the Native Americans were recast as cosmic struggles between the forces of good and evil, the denouement of the eschatological drama in which God's new chosen people confronts hordes of, quite literally, demonic others. In the racial curse story, finally, Noah places a curse on one of his three sons, Ham, and Ham's descendants bear mark on their body. They're destined for servitude. And guess where Ham's descendants settle down? Why, in Africa, of course, which, so the story goes, is why Africans are Black and why it's God's will that they be enslaved. By 1690, the three ingredients of white Christian nationalism were ready to be mixed together by Protestant theologians. And Cotton Mather, the famed Puritan theologian, was one of the first to serve it up. In fact, his ecclesiastical history of New England really remains the urtext of white Christian nationalism. Now, white Christian nationalism has evolved over the centuries, and in The Flag and the Cross, Perry and I distinguish 5 phases in its development. Here, I'm just going to highlight some of the ways that the 5th phase, which we call white Judeo-Christian nationalism, also known as American exceptionalism, differs from earlier phases, and then I'll suggest that we may be witnessing the emergence of a 6th phase today. The 5th phase begins after World War II. It differed from previous phases in at least 5 ways. First, whiteness was defined more expansively. The Irish and Italians became fully white, so did Jews. Second, Blackness was invoked more discreetly starting in the 1970s, with dog whistles rather than bullhorns, with political innuendo rather than racial epithets. Third, Protestant Christianity gave way to the quote-unquote Judeo-Christian tradition, which meant that Catholics could now be real Americans. Even Jews could in this new tri-faith America of the 1950s and 60s. Fourth, America was now defined in national rather than openly imperialist terms. America still had an empire, of course, though it was cleverly hidden, as the historian Daniel Immerwahr has shown. Fifth and finally, the loudest advocates of white Christian nationalism were now conservative evangelicals. This is an important point because for most of American history, it was the old mainline Protestant denominations, the descendants of the original New England Puritans, who had played this role. Some will perhaps remember the old quip about the Episcopal Church being the Republican Party at prayer. The elder Bush was one of the last representatives of this WASP elite. Now, I've said a bit about when white Christian nationalism took shape and how it's evolved over time. It's waxed as well as waned. Looking back through American history, I would point to 4 catalysts of white Christian nationalism: wars against religio-cultural others, periods of mass immigration, times of economic turbulence, and movements of Black empowerment. If you're paying attention, check, 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 and check, it's little wonder that we're experiencing a powerful resurgence of white Christian nationalism today. So much for the when question. What about the how, as in how does it work politically? The short answer is in concert with what we call white Christian individualism. Like white Christian nationalism, white Christian individualism emerged long ago and has evolved over time. The Puritan warrior is an early example. He built a city on a hill and burned down native settlements. Later examples include the Christian slaveholder who ruled with a mixture of pious benevolence and brutal violence, or the Christian homesteader who settled the frontier and slaughtered the natives, or the Cold War evangelical who battled godless communism abroad and supported McCarthyism at home. All were prepared to use violence to defend their liberty and impose law and order on others. The contemporary version of white Christian individualism is what our fellow sociologist Gerardo Marti has called Christian libertarianism. It emerged during the middle decades of the 20th century and is better known by its nickname, personal accountability. It presumes that one's lot in life is a result of one's personal choices, and only of those choices. Historical and social contexts are completely irrelevant. Wealth or poverty, salvation or damnation, bliss or despair, it's basically all up to you. But you will also be held to account for your choices, whether by the market or by God, though in this vision it's hard to tell one invisible hand for the other, at least for a Christian libertarian. Now, white Christian nationalism and white Christian individualism work in concert. They're really like two sides of the same coin. One is just the flip side of the other. When white Christians make claims on other Americans, they do so in the name of national unity and solidarity. But when racial and religious others make claims on white Christians, they are refused in the name of individual rights and personal accountability. In this, white Christian nationalism is just a local manifestation of Will Hoyt's law. To wit, reactionary politics consists of exactly one proposition: there must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. Let's take a quick look at contemporary politics to see this law in action. And let's start with the Tea Party. You'll remember them, right? Though it does seem like an awfully long time ago. Anyway, it all started on February 19th of 2009, roughly 1 month after the inauguration of America's first Black president. Rick Santelli, a financial reporter with CNBC, delivered a viral rant from the trading floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. He blamed the 2008 financial crisis on losers who had taken out mortgages they couldn't afford and excoriated President Obama for bailing them out. He then called for the formation of a new Tea Party to resist federal taxation and defend individual rights. Taxed enough already, get it? So this sounds secular and libertarian, but here's the thing. As academics and journalists began researching Tea Party supporters and organizations, they made several important discoveries. Most Tea Partiers turned out to be older white evangelical men who were also generally supportive of the idea that America is a Christian nation. Also, well-known evangelical political activists were centrally involved. In fact, Ralph Reed originally formed his Faith and Freedom Coalition to support the Tea Party movement. What's more, religion was also raced. Tea Partiers were generally opposed to non-white immigration. Indeed, some Tea Party groups even emerged out of white vigilante groups. In short, the Tea Party was shot through with white Christian nationalism. Now let's shift our focus to the MAGAverse. In his 2017 inaugural address, President Trump promised the American people would take back their country. They would band together around Christianity. They would start winning again and saying Merry Christmas again and bring Christianity back because it's a good thing. They would also put America first, restore law and order, build a great wall around the nation to keep out criminals and illegals, and institute a total ban on Muslims. Now, that sounds an awful lot like Christian nationalism, right? And indeed, one way of understanding Trumpism is as a reactionary and secularized version of white Christian nationalism. Reactionary in the sense that it abandons the polite rhetoric of colorblindness and American exceptionalism in favor of racist language about blood and violence. Poison the blood, I am your retribution. And secularized in the sense that apocalypticism gives way to catastrophizing. You won't have a country. You're going to lose your country. And good and evil are replaced by friend and foe, loyalists and traitors. Kind of like Carl Schmitt for the masses, if you will. But just as the Tea Party's libertarian facade hid white Christian nationalism, so too does Trumpism resonate with what Pierre and I call the holy trinity of white Christian individualism: freedom, violence, and order. First, violence. We all know that Trump is a master of verbal violence. He uses words as weapons to wound his opponents and intimidate his rivals. Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe, Lying Ted, Little Marco, Low Energy Jeb, Meatball Ron. Of course, Trump is not above threatening or inciting physical violence either. He did so on the campaign trail in 2016 and 2020, and of course on January 6th, and is doing so again in his 2024 campaign. Nice little democracy you have there, shame if something happened to it, says the political version of the mob boss. Now for freedom. When criticized for his intemperate speech, the insults, the threats, the profanity, Trump and his supporters like to style themselves as defenders of free speech and opponents of cancel culture who dare to be politically correct. In other words, they claim the God-given right to use racist and sexist language with impunity, as in the good old days of Mad Men and Jim Crow. Finally, order, by which I mean racial order and gender order. Trump's response to BLM was to call for law and order, which is to say, white male violence, police violence, vigilante violence, even, if he'd had his way, military violence. Trump sent in federal agents to Portland and Seattle. He would have sent in the military too if his advisors had not stopped him from invoking the Insurrection Act. Meanwhile, his response to white male violence in Charlottesville and Washington, D.C., was unrepentant words about very fine people and patriotic Americans. As you may know, he now opens his rallies with the so-called J6 chorus, a rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner by violent J6 protesters currently housed in the D.C. jail, with Trump's voiceover of the Pledge of Allegiance. Let me now conclude with some thoughts about the recent past and the near future, about where we're coming from and where we might be headed. The Republican coalition that elected Ronald Reagan is often described as a three-legged stool. The three legs are neoconservative hawks, pro-market neoliberals, and religious traditionalists. This description has always been incomplete. The stool also had a concealed fourth leg, anti-Black racism. It was a chair, not a stool. Now, the chair was always rickety. Like any political coalition, it was cobbled together out of various mismatched pieces. Free market capitalism doesn't really go together with family values, for example, nor does classical liberalism comport well with anti-Black racism. And a hawkish foreign policy and small government conservatism are also deeply at odds. Over the last 2 decades, the Reagan coalition has come under increasing strain. The cost of the Second War in both blood and treasure soured the Republican base on American interventionism. Then the 2008 financial crisis undermined popular faith in free markets. The election of America's first Black president that same year stoked white racial grievance. So when Donald Trump rode down the golden escalator and plopped down on Reagan's chair, it shattered to pieces. Trump and his followers are now busily trying to reassemble the pieces into a golden throne. We are in the middle of what political scientists call an electoral realignment. The outcome of that process is uncertain. Perhaps left and right will fall into progressive and populist camps, or perhaps the dividing line will be liberal Democrats versus would-be authoritarians, or some mix of the two. We are also in the midst of what might be called a religious realignment. The once mighty ranks of liberal Protestantism grow smaller and grayer by the year. Meanwhile, the so-called ranks of the so-called religious nones continue to expand apace. Indeed, the religion of no religion now counts around a quarter of the American populace, about the same number who call themselves evangelicals. Let me just put this into historical perspective. At the time of the American Revolution, fully 99% of the citizenry identified as white Protestants. That number sank below 50% for the first time around a decade ago. Today, the percentage of white Christians of any persuasion is in the low 40%. What about non-Christian religions? In fact, they only account for a minuscule percentage of the population. Less than 1% of Americans are Muslims, for example. But of course, they loom much larger in the conservative imagination. Is it any wonder then that conservative white Christians are gripped by moral and demographic panics? The result is radicalization. White Christian nationalism also seems to be changing shape once again. The new avant-garde is not evangelicals, it's Pentecostals, particularly a network of radical Pentecostals known as the New Apostolic Reformation. You see, I think I've got a slide here I want to show you all. There we go. These Pentecostal radicals differ from conservative evangelicals in a number of ways. First, in terms of their understanding of the end times story. Most evangelicals were just waiting passively for the end times. Some Pentecostals think they can, force the end. On their view, Christians are commanded to, quote, seize dominion over the 7 mountains of social influence. That is, they must conquer the commanding heights in religion, family, education, government, media, arts, and entertainment, and business. Then, and only then, but precisely then, they believe, will Jesus return. Which is not to say that the battle between good and evil is not already going on. Pentecostals and other charismatics also believe that there is a constant battle between visible and invisible forces. Some view their religious and political enemies as literal instruments of Satan. They refer to this struggle as spiritual warfare. One example, on January 5th, 2021, a group of Pentecostals held a so-called Jericho March in Washington, D.C. They marched around the Capitol blowing the ceremonial ram's horns known as shofars. The goal was to drive away the demonic forces they believed had taken possession of the Capitol building itself and of the Democratic congressional delegation inside. Many returned the next day as well to cheer on or participate in the failed insurrection. On average, Pentecostals score much higher than evangelicals on the white Christian nationalism scale. In fact, the majority explicitly reject the separation of church and state. The overwhelming majority believe that America should be officially declared a Christian nation, too, even if they also affirm that this would be against the Constitution. In other words, these folks are no, quote, constitutional conservatives. They're theocratic radicals. The second change I want to highlight is somewhat paradoxical. At the same time that white Christian nationalism is becoming more radical, it's also becoming less religious, and for at least 2 reasons. One is that evangelical is fast becoming a political label. How so? Well, many self-identified evangelicals don't really attend church. In fact, some don't even identify as Christian. For these people, evangelical just equals conservative equals MAGA. And this shows up in the data in some weird ways. A surprising number of non-churchgoers and even some non-Christians now tell survey researchers that they are, quote, evangelicals. Another reason is that many white supremacists are rebranding themselves as Christian nationalism. Here's a recent book by Andrew Torba, the notorious anti-Semite who founded Gab, the right-wing social media platform. He has an audience. The book debuted at number 12 on Amazon. Of course, white supremacists have been an important part of the conservative coalition since Nixon debuted a Southern strategy in 1972, but they were more of a silent partner than a leading actor. Ditto for militia groups. Not anymore. Here's another paradox for you. Even as the influence of white supremacist groups has grown, the centrality of whiteness might be declining. More and more Latino Americans have been converting to evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, and their politics often follows their religion, namely to the right. Have a look at this roster of radical Pentecostal leaders of the New Apostolic Reformation. Not all white, right? So where's this going? Truth is, it's hard to say. In principle, I see 2 possible outcomes. One is that more and more Latinos reject the people of color label and claim whiteness. The other is that white Christian nationalism sheds its anti-Blackness and becomes nativist Christian nationalism, or both. Contradictions in logic are, of course, not always contradictions in politics. There's also one more shift that I want to highlight. Until fairly recently, white Christian nationalism tended to be triumphal in tone. The WASP belief that ran the country up through the 1960s tended to see themselves as conquerors rather than victims. Theirs was the spirit of Julia Ward Howe's battle hymn of the Republic. Our truth is marching on. The evangelicals who succeeded them were also optimists. They cheered when Reagan proclaimed Morning America in his re-election campaign in 1984. Not anymore. George W. Bush sensed the vibe shift in real time. You can hear it in his reaction to Trump's inaugural address on American carnage. That's some weird shit, he whispered to Michelle Obama? Well, yes and no. Yes, if you're comparing it to the watered-down euphemisms of Reaganite American exceptionalism, but not at all if you turn the calendar back another half century to the full-throated white supremacist Christian nationalism of the 19th century. Though there is one important difference. Earlier versions of Christian nationalism were not animated by grievance, nor were they led by would-be messiahs. That too has changed. The Trump campaign recently disseminated a video entitled "God Made Trump," and some of his supporters evidently agree. From the New York Times, "I voted for Trump twice, and I'll vote for him again," said Sidney Hatfield, a retired corrections officer in Laurelville, Iowa. "He's the only savior I can see." So that's where we are. Where might we be headed? One scenario is what social scientists call Herrenvolk democracy, that is, master race democracy. Specifically, a parliamentary regime in which the exercise of power and suffrage is restricted de facto and often de jure to the dominant group, and in which that group understands itself as a superior race and subjects other races to varying degrees of legal repression and extra-legal violence. In other words, Jim Crow 2.0. This, I think, is the likely path if the current Republican coalition regains control of the Senate and the White House in 2024 and manipulates voting and elections thereafter. As in Jim Crow 1.0, your rights may vary by race and religion and also by gender. This, of course, is not the only possible scenario. There are at least two others. The first is the bare survival of liberal democracy as we've known it, which is to say the status quo ante since the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of the mid-1960s. The second is the achievement of a multiracial democracy, which is to say a nation of nations and a people of peoples in which these rights are enforced and extended and historic injustices recognized and perhaps even undone. Which, if any of these three scenarios will become reality, is hard to say. Historical outcomes are highly contingent, which is why the social sciences are notoriously bad at prediction. This much is certain, though, much will depend on the choices of American Christians and their leaders, but also on those of secular progressives and their leaders. America is at a crossroads. It's been there before, more than once. To the left lies a path towards a multiracial democracy. To the right, a path towards continued white patriarchal dominance. In the past, America has sometimes turned left for a moment, only to veer sharply back to the right in the end. This is what happened in 1787, in 1877, and again in 1968, when it incorporated slavery into the Constitution, when it turned the South over to Confederate redeemers, and when it chose law and order and the war on drugs over civil rights and affirmative action. Each time, the country took 2 steps forward, then 1 giant step backwards. Which way are we going to turn this time? The answer, I think, will depend on the choices we make in the coming years, also in this year. Will conservative white Christians accept their new minority status, or will they attempt to cling by power by any means necessary, including minority rule or authoritarian rule? In short, will they choose democracy or power? And what of secular progressives? Will they make room for people of faith and their vision of a multiracial democracy? Will they accept religion as one element of diversity? Or will they instead fulfill conservatives' worst fears about progressive attacks on religious freedom? For my part, I hope that America will finally take the road towards inclusive democracy. Thank you.
How do you think this will play out in the elections, given Biden's support of genocide in Gaza? It seems it's undermining sort of what I would maybe say is a project to defend democracy and defeat an authoritarian sort of neo-fascist state. And the Democrats' support of the ongoing war against Palestinians really muddies the water, I think, for millions of people in America on which way to vote. So I'm interested in how do you see the coming election?
There are so many moving pieces that it's really difficult to make any firm prognostications. If I had to kind of set the odds right now, I kind of put them somewhere around 50-50, give or take. There's no doubt that the ongoing Israeli attack on Gaza and the slowness of the Biden administration to really distance itself in any meaningful way and to do anything to stop the military operation is likely to hurt Biden, at least at the margins. For example, in Michigan, which has a fairly large Muslim population and is a very important swing state, as we all know. I mean, I do have to hope that there will be some sort of resolution of the conflict, and that the Biden administration will take some positive steps in the next month or two. I mean, clearly there are things going on behind the scenes in terms of aid efforts and applying greater pressure to Netanyahu. I do think people have to ask themselves the question of whether withholding a vote from Biden and effectively casting a half vote for Trump is going to lead to a better outcome in Gaza. I think this is a very morally vexed choice and situation, but I can't imagine that things would go much better or any better, would probably go far worse for the Palestinians if Trump and his ilk were to return to power. But there's no doubt that that conflict has really created enormous divides on between the center left and the left in a way that bodes ill for the outcome of the election.
Thanks so much for that question, Jerry. Next, we'll go to Morgan Henson. Morgan.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this talk. I was really looking forward to this. Towards the end of your talk, you brought up either a trend that you're seeing or a possibility of the people in the Latino community no longer identifying as people of color. And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that, because within the Latino community, there are people of many different colors and many different races, white Latinos, Black Latinos, so on. And so are there certain subgroups within that community that you see this trend more common, or exactly what's going on there? Thank you.
Sure thing. So, I don't know that I can, really parse this question in any great detail, but I think that the point that you make is a really, really important one. I think there are a lot of white folks on the left who tended to see the Latino community through the lens of African Americans, and obviously the experience of Latino Americans is not as unified or unifying has been that of generational African Americans in particular, right, who were cut off from their lands of origin, cut off in many ways from their cultural past, even if it's preserved in certain folk traditions, and are just much more diverse. I mean, in terms of country of origin, color of their skin, immigration status, time in the United States, geographical region. And so I think it's always in a way been a mistake to imagine that it would be that somehow Latinos' experiences were so similar to those of generational African Americans that one could wave a wand, say people of color, and expect all of them to identify with that moniker. I mean, even the label Latino itself, as you probably know, and as sociologists like Christian Nationalism have documented in great detail, was part of a kind of a political and demographic project to kind of assemble a larger voting bloc by creating a sort of a shared label that would increase the electoral power of Latino communities regionally and nationally. So, I don't think we should be shocked, for example, that Latinos in the Rio Grande Valley, some of whom have been there before the United States existed, many of whom have been there for generations, who exist in a very conservative state and kind of very conservative political culture, who are often devout churchgoers, are going to be inclined to drift towards the right and possibly even vote for Trump. And I think it's of course interesting too that we see something, a kind of a similar drift going on amongst a smaller contingent of African Americans, especially African American men, who, though they have no illusions about Trump's racism and prejudice, nonetheless think that he might be better for their pocketbooks and appreciate his sort of masculine swagger. So I do think there are real reasons for worry there too. I don't think that we really will know the answer to some of these broader questions for some time. I mean, I think that just as electoral alliances and the religious landscape are in a moment of flux, so I think too is the racial order in the United States under demographic pressure and political pressure as well, likely to realign in ways that are still hard to foresee at this point.
A quick follow-up to that question from Courtney Parker. Beyond the Latinos and Blacks that you've commented on, Phil, what other current non-white racial or ethnic groups have been embracing or participating more in Christian supremacy and nationalism in your view? Has your research revealed anything more on that matter?
No, I mean, I think really the main group and the most important group that's in play is in fact Latinos, and to a much lesser extent African Americans. I mean, there certainly are, for example, Asian American evangelicals, but I haven't seen anything about significant movement there, and they're not particularly strongly represented amongst Christian nationalists.
Great. John Peck asks, I'm curious about the ties between the U.S. Christian nationalists and right-wing hate groups in other countries. He's thinking specifically of the context of right-wing co-optation of some of the farmers' protests that are occurring in Europe right now, particularly France. And do you have any insight or thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very important question. I organized a couple of conferences on this. I have another one coming up in Europe in the summer. I think the truth is we don't really have solid research on this yet. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence about connections between the far right and the US and Latin America and Europe. All you really have to do is to sort of look at who's showing up to give Viktor Orban a tongue bath in Budapest, right? To see what a sort of wide-ranging group that is. I mean, the only thing that, to my knowledge, has been carefully researched so far are the ties between American evangelicals and the Russian Orthodox Church, in particular through an organization known as the World Council on Families. But I mean, there's no doubt that these folks are in touch with each other, that they're watching each other, that they're sharing strategies, and that they're increasingly connected with each other. I sometimes refer to this as the sort of Christian Nationalist International. Just as fascists, ultranationalists, recognize one another as like-minded actors in the interwar period. So I think we see a similar trend amongst alt-right and Christian nationalist actors around the world today, but we don't yet really understand fully the networks through which ideas and people and money are flowing.
I have a few more questions from the chat, and then we'll proceed to Ian. Mary Road asks, what is your impression of the role of the news media or social media in influencing white Christian nationalism and its development?
Of course, it's significant. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything that they don't already know, that the information system, news environment is increasingly balkanized, and this has made it much easier not only for disinformation to spread, but also for people who occupy relatively extreme positions to find one another. I suppose the most important effect, and of course also not a novel observation, is the mainstreaming of what used to be really fringe and far right content. And so that probably the best example of this would be great replacement theory, which, in case you're not familiar with it, is the idea that there's a sort of shadowy cabal of elites, maybe Jewish, who are systematically bringing non-white people to Europe and the United States with the goal of taking over the country and replacing the quote-unquote native born white populations. That is something that you would have had to subscribe to, like Stormfront newsletter 20 years ago to encounter. It's an old theory that goes back at least to the 90s, and in some iterations back to the 30s, but one that Tucker Carlson propagated with some regularity on his Fox News show, and that is practically kind of conventional wisdom now amongst on the MAGA right. So it's creating the social media has both created these kind of affinity groups, but also has allowed very radical content to get into the mainstream ecosystem.
A question from Howard Winan. In your view, Phil, what is the role of labor and the labor movement and the prospects for its role in challenging this particular right-wing trend or other right-wing trends that we're seeing in the political space?
Well, I mean, I'm like everyone else here. I imagine I'm heartened to see the recent resurgence of the labor movement in the United States and a fortiori in parts of Europe. The sort of massive waves of strikes, for example, that have been going on over the past year in Germany. And I think one of the things that's really important and does not get enough attention is the role of labor unions in countering right-wing free market hegemony. There's the sort of organizational advantage that the right has, especially the Christian right has, especially in the United States, is that it gets its people assembled in one place, at least once a week. And there's just with the decline of the labor movement, there's nothing really quite equivalent. And so I think the labor movement is really one of the few movements within the United States, apart perhaps from the Black church, that really has this potential to act as a kind of counter-hegemonic actor that can meaningfully challenge white Christian nationalism going forward. But I think we should have no illusions that they have more people and more resources than we do right now, and that desperately needs to change.
Thank you for that. Ian, you've been very patient. I'm going to ask you to unmute to ask your question. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, just to ask how much of this is, in a sense, our fault or the wider left's fault, that certainly a couple of years ago, or couple of presidential cycles ago, there were almost parallel movements around Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And now Bernie's gone away, endorsing Biden, the squad. A lot of people on the left see as hugely disappointing. At the same time, the right are riled up against them. So there's kind of, they've burnt the candle on both ends in that way. So the two insurgencies against the establishment, the one that's lasted is the right at this stage. And maybe that's partly because of the deeper roots that you're describing, but how much is it also tactical mistakes or failure of nerve or principle of Bernie but collapsing behind Biden and Hillary before that? And also the way Biden's been trying to block Trump seems to be totally counterproductive with these court cases that don't seem to be going anywhere, but making him look like a martyr to his base, or stuff about not allowing Hunter Biden's laptop to be referred to on Twitter. Again, just makes him look like he's being persecuted and gives him a credibility that he obviously doesn't deserve when you look at what his actual policies are, as well as all the stuff around the Ukraine war that motivates less people in Palestine, but again is a big blot on Biden. Would be, I'm sure, better for America, but I'm not sure overall who'd be worse for the world sometimes.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I do think there is just a fundamental strategic dilemma faced by folks who want to defend liberal democracy, which is how do you defend a rule-based order against people who are against rules? It's a situation of asymmetric conflict, and so there is, of course, the temptation to kind of get down in the mud and play dirty. But how do you do that if you want to present yourself as Mr. or Mrs. Clean, who's standing up for regular order and the rule of law and individual rights and so on and so forth? It's this extremely tricky tactical and strategic situation. I don't know what the answer is. I do think that even within those strategic constraints that Merrick Garland in particular bears a great deal of responsibility for the current situation. Had he initiated some of these court cases against Trump in a more timely fashion, which is to say in a couple of months after January 6th, it's not clear that Trump's typical tried and true Roy Cohn-esque delaying tactics would have been sufficient to push his trials past Election Day. Though with the latest solid that SCOTUS did Trump, it appears very unlikely that the DC case, which is the most explosive and the most serious, is going to happen anytime before Election Day. And of course, if Trump's elected, it will never happen. So that's one side of it. I think the other question you're asking is the one about kind of arrogant gerontocracy, which currently dominates the Democratic Party. I find this also incredibly frustrating. I, like many folks, wish that Biden had kept his promise to be a bridge and had stepped aside in 2022 and let various folks on the bench, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, et cetera, fight it out for the Democratic nomination. But obviously that's not what happened. And it could be with very serious consequences. Need I mention Ruth Bader Ginsburg's, in my view, incredibly arrogant and hubristic decision to remain in office a couple of months too long, which basically cost us Roe v. Wade, which should have been something that would have been foremost in her mind when she was making that decision. I truly don't understand the psychology of it, just other than perhaps that, there's something about a kind of meritocratic, technocratic, Ivy League educated political and judicial elite that we have now that is so invested, in its own kind of career success that it makes it impossible to just kind of accept the reality of the aging process and make way for another generation. But that's just armchair psychologizing. I really have no idea, but I find it incredibly frustrating as well.
Thank you for that. James Rosenberg has asked, how does white Christian nationalism relate to other post-liberal tendencies in the US, notably those associated with Silicon Valley? The two would seem to share a rejection of certain liberal or democratic tenets, but also tend to differ in other ways.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I've already mentioned the relationship with white nationalist and militia and white supremacist groups. So there's really nothing new. Those groups have always done what they're doing now, which is to kind of glom on to groups that appear somewhat more respectable as a way of mainstreaming their ideas. Some folks out there will be old enough to remember David Duke's run for governor of Louisiana in, I believe it was the late 90s. That's a kind of paradigmatic example of that strategy. More interesting in certain ways is, as you say, the relationship between this Silicon Valley elite and white Christian nationalism. Here a particularly interesting case is Peter Thiel. So I know somebody who is writing a book on him and has had 20, 30 hours already of sit-down interviews with Thiel. And Thiel does have some very peculiar views. He embraces, a certain kind of apocalypticism. His sort of fear of a kind of a one world government that aligns with, a certain kind of apocalypticism. He was also, while at Stanford, a student of René Girard's, who's a kind of iconoclastic, reactionary Catholic intellectual. So there are, in some cases, religious affinities between some of these people, though I think Thiel in that regard is probably more the exception than the rule. I think really the key affinity is the inclination towards authoritarianism. So obviously they have somewhat different visions of the kind of authoritarian leader that they would like. The kind of Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel, and all crowd would like to see a kind of some kind of technocratic autocracy. Some of them have been fascinated, for example, with the rule of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, which is probably one of the closest equivalents to what they have in mind, of a kind of expert technocratic rule. But the other thing, of course, that they share is this this inclination for disruption, and the belief that to start something new you have to burn everything down. And so they do, of course, see Trump, if nothing else, as somebody who would clear the ground for a kind of social order that they would like. And then let's not forget there are just purely material interests at stake. Musk and a lot of these guys, as I think we all know, didn't really make their fortunes on the quote unquote free market. They got rich through various forms of kind of crony capitalism that required connections with the government and acquisition of government contracts. And it's certainly true of Musk, right? Who's become kind of the monopoly supplier of jet propulsion and satellite data. So all of that together, I think does make for a certain kind of alliance. And there probably is a little bit of a kind of old school incel vibe amongst misogynistic vibe amongst some of these guys as well that draws them to kind of a serial rapist and misogynist like Trump.
My remarks vary. Please ask your question.
Hi, Phil. What I really, unsurprisingly, what I'm interested in here is the gender dimension that you've kind of left low on this. And I've been very impressed with the argument the religious historian does in Jesus and John Wayne about how central masculinism is in the evangelical version, not just whiteness, that has been developing, and the sort of secular patriarchal politics that invades this and the role of the West. What she sort of stops short of is the New Apostolic Reformation. And I'm kind of interested in what you see as the connections between that New Apostolic Reformation and the patriarchal conflation of a certain kind of John Wayne masculinity with what it is that men are supposed to be in that Christian context or pseudo-Christian context.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Myra. The reason really why we didn't spend more time talking about the gender and masculinist dimension of white Christian nationalism and the flag and the cross is because Cobus de May just beat us to the punch and did it so masterfully. I mean, there just wasn't a whole lot left to say. If you didn't catch the reference, this was to the brilliantly entitled book Jesus and John Wayne, which is kind of a history of evangelical Christianity since the early 20th century, which looks at the way in which Christianity was systematically made comfortable and even attractive for a certain kind of white men by turning Jesus into, well, a sort of a John Wayne like figure over time. New Apostolic Reformation, not sure. It's a more complicated movement, certainly racially, and there are a number of very, very important female prophets or apostles in the movement, such as the one in the Cindy Jacobs, who's pictured on the slide that I posted. Pentecostalism is really a sort of a different beast than evangelicalism is, in part because of its historical origins. As you may know, it begins in the early 20th century as kind of a lower class, not even working class movement in Los Angeles. It was from the very beginning, a multiracial movement. One of the most important figures, Parham, was an African American. Yeah, so it's just a much more complicated movement and a much more variegated movement. So I don't know that it will be quite as focused on masculinity as white evangelicalism has been. But again, time will tell. Often the political tail wags the theological dog, especially in recent years. But you're absolutely right to foreground the kind of masculinist patriarchal element in white Christian nationalism, and the restoration of patriarchy is absolutely central as one of their political goals. I mean, that's really what a lot of the talk about, restoring the family, quote unquote, is about. And of course, it's also where the opposition to gay rights, transgenderism is coming from as well. I mean, it's an attempt to reimpose a kind of old-fashioned version of hegemonic masculinity on American culture.
Mm-hmm. Michael Olnick has pointed out in the chat that we tend to talk about all of this in national terms. And he asks if you can speak to how resistance to Christian nationalism is playing out in localities. For example, in education, there has been somewhat successful mobilization in opposition to the right in local school board elections. What has your research borne out? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, there are it's an important point, and there actually are now a number of different activist networks that have emerged that are for folks to sort of share resources and share experiences across different localities about fighting these more local fights. I mean, in fact, in a couple of weeks, there'll be sort of a kickoff here in New Haven for a new center that Reverend William Barber, the leader of the Poor People's Campaign, who recently moved to the Yale Divinity School here, brought his entire organizing staff along. I mean, they're sort of ramping up an organization like this. Other that's been doing really great work is the Baptist Joint Committee. So a fair number of these, have, some kind of religious or denominational backbone to them, but that's not, not the only example. I mean, there's, the Freedom from Religion Foundation and some of the humanist and atheist networks as well around the country have been doing work like this too, often aligning themselves, in fact, with these sort of left-wing faith-based groups.
Pete Remand, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi there. First, thanks for a really brilliant talk. I really enjoyed that. So I've got two questions. I'll be as quick as possible at them, but I'm interested in the conceptual categories you've deployed to explain support for radical right politics. I see that because since 2016, the concept that's probably been most commonly used to explain the phenomena you're talking about is populism. And sociologists have intervened to argue that there's always a nationalist component to populist politics, because claims about the people always has at least an implicit frame. I'm thinking here about people like Rogers Brubaker and Bart Bonikowski. But I'm wondering, does your emphasis on white Christian nationalism mean that you think anti-elite sentiments are less central in explaining support for politicians like Trump? So basically, I'm just interested in how you think about this and how you've navigated this problem in your thinking. And secondly, your talk made me think about the chapter that you wrote in your edited book on Bourdieu on nationalization struggles. And I'm just wondering how much the theoretical framework you developed there, in pretty abstract terms, influenced the strategy you adopted in approaching this question.
Very, very insightful observations and very good question. For sure, a broadly Bourdieusian framework is operating in the background of this book, but Sam and I were really determined to write something that could be read by non-academics, by educated non-academics. So we just kept that all pretty much under the hood. But for example, I think it's very clear that some of the political allies and some of the politicians and their religious allies occupy homologous spaces in their respective fields, and this is one of the reasons why they have allied with one another. Let me though turn to the question about populism. So I'm not sure it's super productive, except maybe in career terms, to fight too terribly much about, is it ethno-nationalism? Is it right-wing populism? Is it Christian nationalism? I mean, I think it might be useful to try to, parse out, which people and organization ideas are, most firmly derived from one or the other of those traditions. But, if your real object of explanation is the MAGAverse, and obviously, these are all, kind of large planetary systems that, exert considerable gravity within that cosmos. I mean, in terms of that said, I mean, I think that, there probably are some things that there are some deep affinities between populism and Christian nationalism, and also some things that a Christian nationalist approach illuminates that populist approach doesn't. So, just first off, some of the affinities, right? So the kind of standard account of right-wing populism is, at least the version I would prefer, is, a pure people betrayed by a corrupt elite in cahoots with a cultural invader or other that will be rescued by a kind of a strong leader or political messiah, right? I mean, that's basically the populist script. It's important to see ways in which that script echoes themes that you would find amongst white Christian nationalists too. So, the idea that there are these cultural elites or secular humanists or, woke progressives or, whatever kind of epithet you choose to apply, who are kind of corrupting the country, that that the true people are white Christians, that sort of non-whites and non-Christian invaders represent a threat to Judeo-Christian culture. The tendency to put faith in sort of charismatic leadership figures in the church initially, but also in politics, right? I mean, there's all these ways in which the kind of populist script is just going to resonate very, very deeply with a kind of certain kind of conservative white Christian. And I don't think that's an accident. I mean, I have the somewhat unorthodox view that Western nationalisms have their historical origins in a supersessionist version of Western Christianity. And you can see this specifically, these ideas about new Israel, new chosen people. I just hasten to add that this is an idea that's you might associate with the United States, but there's nothing specifically American about it. You will find it in the history of practically every country, certainly the UK, but also in the other British settler colonies, whether you're talking about Northern Ireland or South Africa or Australia, you find similar versions of this idea. It's very, it's a great vehicle for settler colonialism, right? I mean, you sort of equate yourself with this, the Exodus, persecution, your new promised land. So I mean, there are really very deep reasons why these scripts are just so similar, and I think this also, sort of explains why certain kinds of ethno-nationalism, also really resonate with populists and white Christian nationalists, because again, if you think of a certain kind of Christian nationalism as sort of the version of ethno-nationalism, which is my view, then there is a kind of a religious unconscious in any putatively secular nationalism, which simply needs to be reawakened. And this is why I think you see, even in the most secular parts of Europe, where very few people go to church, where very few people are religious believers, that nonetheless talk about Christianity and Christian civilization plays an outsized role in kind of populist discourse even there. So it's sort of a long-winded answer, but I think it's more interesting to think about the way these things go together than to sort of squabble over whether one or the other is somehow the concept that best explains everything.
What a fantastic place to end. I'm afraid we are near time. So on behalf of the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice, I'd really like to thank Phil Gorski again for his time today and his really important contributions in understanding of this moment and the moments to come. We are really grateful that you all came to join us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Until then, be well. Take care.
Thank you all.